I want you to imagine the moment you realize that the person you love most in this world, the one who held your hand through every dark night, who knew every secret you'd never told anyone else, has been quietly, methodically, and deliberately destroying your life. Not out of jealousy you could have seen coming, not out of a moment of weakness or rage, but with a plan. A long, patient, beautiful plan. That's where my story begins. And I need you to stay with me, because by the time I'm done, you're going to understand why I did what I did. And you're going to be glad I did it. My name is Mara. I'm 34 years old. I grew up in a small city in Ohio, the kind of place where everybody knows your business, but nobody actually knows you. I was the first person in my family to get a college degree, the first to start a business, and for a while, I thought I was going to be the first to really make it. I co-founded a tech consulting firm called Linden & Cross with my best friend Diane when we were 27. We'd met in college, been inseparable ever since, and everyone who knew us said we were the kind of friends who only came along once in a lifetime. They were right about that, just not in the way they meant. Diane was brilliant, sharp, magnetic, the kind of woman who walked into a room and made everyone else feel like they'd been waiting for her. I was the engine behind the scenes, built the systems, secured the clients, wrote the code, managed the finances. She was the face. We were a perfect team, or so I believed. By the time we hit our early 30s, Linden & Cross had 12 employees, 2 major government contracts, an evaluation that made my mother cry happy tears at Thanksgiving. I was engaged to a man named Joel, a civil engineer who smelled like cedar and always remembered to fill my gas tank when I forgot. Life was the kind of good that makes you nervous, the kind you keep waiting to be taken away. It was taken away on a Tuesday in March. I remember it was raining. I remember, because I'd worn new shoes and I was annoyed about the puddles. And then I walked into our office and found the locks had been changed. My key card didn't work. The receptionist, a young woman named Priya, who'd always brought me coffee without being asked, looked at me with this expression I will never forget. It was pity. Deep, uncomfortable, genuine pity. She told me Diane had called an emergency board meeting the night before. She told me there had been a vote. She told me, quietly, that I had been removed as co-CEO, and that my shares in the company had been, and she used the word, disputed. I stood in that lobby, rain still dripping from my coat, and I felt the floor tilt beneath me, like the world was a ship that had just lost its rudder. Within 48 hours, I learned the full shape of what had happened. Diane had spent the better part of a year quietly convincing our 3 board members, all of whom she'd personally recruited, I would later realize, that I had been mismanaging funds. She had documentation, spreadsheets, emails, a forensic accounting report from a firm I'd never heard of that somehow showed irregular transfers bearing my digital signature. Every piece of evidence was precise, professional, and completely fabricated. But I didn't know that yet. At the time, all I knew was that my best friend of 12 years had stood in a conference room I wasn't allowed to enter and told a room full of people that I was a thief. Joel left 3 weeks later. He said he believed me, but he didn't. You can tell when someone is staying out of obligation versus love, and he was staying out of obligation. When he finally packed a bag, I didn't even fight it. I was too exhausted. I was living in my apartment, hemorrhaging legal fees, and spending 16 hours a day trying to find a lawyer who would take my case on contingency. My credit was frozen. My professional reputation was shredded. Former colleagues stopped returning calls. Clients I'd personally brought in for years stopped responding to emails. Whatever Diane had told people, she had told it well, and she had told it everywhere. Here's the thing about losing everything. When you have nothing left to protect, when the social performance of your life has been stripped down to the studs, what's left is just you. Raw, quiet, and very, very focused. I stopped crying around month 2. I started making lists. The first thing I did was hire a private forensic accountant with the last of my savings. a retired IRS investigator named Harold, who worked out of a strip mall in Columbus and charged less than he should have, because, as he told me, he hated financial fraud with a personal passion. Harold spent 6 weeks going through every document Diane's team had submitted. He found the fractures almost immediately. The timestamps on certain files were inconsistent with the software versions supposedly used to create them. One of the email headers had metadata pointing to an IP address registered to a shell company in Delaware. It wasn't airtight yet, but it was a thread, and I had become very good at pulling threads. It was during this same period that I heard about Marcus Webb. Marcus was a mid-level analyst who'd worked at Linden & Cross for about 2 years before leaving quietly the previous fall. I barely remembered him. But a former colleague of mine, a woman named Rita, who'd also been pushed out after my removal, mentioned his name over coffee one afternoon with a strange, careful look on her face. She said Marcus had been asking questions before he left. Questions about the board meetings. Questions about certain financial arrangements. She said he'd reached out to her once, said he'd found something, said he was going to report it. And then, about 3 weeks before I was removed from my own company, Marcus Webb was found dead in his apartment in Cleveland. The official ruling was accidental overdose. He was 29 years old, and according to everyone who knew him, had never touched drugs in his life. I want to be very precise about what happened inside me when Rita told me that. There was no dramatic moment of revelation. It was quieter than that. It was like watching a key slide into a lock. Everything I had suspected about Diane, the calculation, the patience, the willingness to go further than any reasonable person would, suddenly had a weight to it that I hadn't allowed myself to feel before. This was something else, something colder. I went back to Harold. I asked him to look specifically at the period around Marcus's death. He found a payment, indirect, routed through 2 LLCs, but traceable, from an account connected to Diane's personal holdings, to a private investigation firm in Pittsburgh. On its own, that meant nothing. People hired investigators for all kinds of reasons. But when Harold cross-referenced the firm's known associates through public litigation records, one name kept appearing. A man who had twice been accused, never convicted, of witness intimidation. I sat with that information for a long time before I decided what to do with it. I did not go to the police, not yet. I had learned enough by then to know that walking into a police station with a thread isn't the same as walking in with a rope. What I needed was someone who could pull harder and in more directions than I could alone. I reached out to an investigative journalist named Carla Voss, who wrote for a regional publication that had broken 2 significant financial fraud stories in the previous 4 years. I sent her a 14-page document I'd spent 3 weeks writing. I titled it simply, "What Diane Cross Did." I told her I wasn't looking for a story. I was looking for the truth, and if the truth happened to become a story, that was Justice's business, not mine. Carla called me back in 48 hours. She had already started pulling on the same threads independently. She told me she'd been tipped about Linden & Cross months ago, but couldn't find a central figure to anchor the reporting. I was that figure. We worked together for the next 4 months. I gave her everything Harold had found. She brought in her own forensic team. Together, we built something airtight. What we found was this. Diane had been systematically diverting client payments through a web of accounts she controlled exclusively. Accounts I had no visibility into because she'd quietly restructured our administrative access over a period of 18 months. The total amount, when Carla's team finished tracing it, was just over $2.3 million. She had been planning to force me out, take full ownership of the company, and erase any record of what she'd taken before any external audit could find it. Marcus Webb had stumbled onto a piece of it while running routine reconciliations. And the investigator Diane had hired, this is where the cold really set in, had been seen on security footage in Marcus's building the night he died. The death was reopened. It is still, as of now, an active investigation. On the morning Carla's story published, I was sitting in my car outside a diner on the edge of Columbus, eating a breakfast sandwich and reading the article on my phone like I was a stranger encountering it for the first time. The headline read, "Co-founder of Ohio tech firm accused of multi-million-dollar fraud, forgery, and potential witness intimidation." By noon, it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By evening, the FBI had opened a formal inquiry. Diane's attorneys released a statement calling the reporting reckless and defamatory. She was photographed leaving her home that evening in sunglasses, despite the fact that it was 6 o'clock in March, and there was no sun. I recognized the way she was holding her shoulders. Tight, controlled, terrified. I had seen that posture once before, years ago, when she thought she was about to fail a bar exam she hadn't studied for. She had that same look. The look of someone who had believed they were untouchable, and was just now understanding they were not. The civil suit to restore my shares and recover damages was filed 4 days later by a firm that came to me, for once. The criminal referral came from the FBI 6 weeks after that. Diane was indicted on 7 counts, including wire fraud, securities fraud, and obstruction of justice. The obstruction charge related specifically to Marcus Webb. That investigation is ongoing, and I will not speak further about it here, because some things are still playing out in ways that require silence. But I will say this. The people who loved Marcus Webb now have answers they didn't have before. That matters more to me than anything else in this story. I want to tell you about the last time I saw Diane in person. It was at a pre-trial hearing, and I was seated in the gallery because I wasn't testifying that day. She walked in, wearing a charcoal blazer, and her hair down, which she always did when she was performing composure. She scanned the room the way she always did, cataloging who was present, making calculations. And then she found me. For about 3 seconds, we just looked at each other. I have thought about what I wanted my face to say in that moment for a long time. What I decided was nothing. I didn't look angry. I didn't look triumphant. I just looked at her the way you look at a problem you've already solved. And then I looked away. That was 6 months ago. The trial is scheduled for later this year. Harold has been asked to serve as an expert witness. Rita got a better job at a firm in Cincinnati and sent me a bottle of wine with a note that said only, "Well done." Joel reached out once, an awkward text that I read and did not reply to. I am not angry at Joel. I am just no longer interested in him. As for me, I started a new consulting firm. Smaller. Just me and 2 people I trust completely. Both of whom I vetted with a thoroughness that would probably seem paranoid to anyone who hadn't lived through what I lived through. We have 3 clients. We are building slowly. I work from a home office with a window that looks out onto a garden I planted last spring, which I did mostly as an act of deliberate optimism, because I needed to believe that things I put into the ground would eventually grow. I think about Marcus Webb sometimes. I think about how he found something wrong and tried to do the right thing, and how the world did not protect him for it. I think about how many other Marcuses there are, people who see the truth and reach for it and get crushed before anyone can catch them. I made a promise to myself that his name would be part of this story, not a footnote in someone else's. I kept that promise. I also think sometimes about who I was before all of this. The woman in the new shoes, annoyed about puddles. The woman who thought she had built something that couldn't be taken. I don't miss her exactly. She trusted because she was taught that trust was a virtue. And it is. It's just not unconditional. It never should have been. The woman I am now trusts slowly, earns slowly, builds slowly, and watches carefully. She is harder in some ways, and softer in others. She keeps a very clean house and a very detailed paper trail. And if you are sitting somewhere right now, feeling like someone has taken everything from you, like the people who are supposed to love you have turned your own life into a weapon against you, I want you to hear me when I say this. The truth is not fragile. It doesn't need you to be loud. It doesn't need you to be fearless. It just needs you to be patient, to be precise, and to refuse, absolutely refuse, to let them make you disappear. They tried to write me out of my own story. I rewrote the ending. Please share and subscribe my channel. I work hard on this.